Good afternoon, and welcome to our panelists and all of our viewers. My name is Audrey Kitagawa. I'm the chair of the Parliament of the World's Religions, a joint sponsor and partner with Religions for Peace USA on today's important program on racism. Where do we go from here? As we strive to improve conversations about race, racism, and racial justice in this country, the environment in which we're having this conversation is filled with the agony, grief, and anger of Americans and people all around the world, joining their voices to speak truth to power. These conversations are more important than ever. Systemic racism is embedded in our workplaces, schools, hospitals, and criminal justice system in ways that many of us may not even notice. Racism affects all of us and prevents us from achieving our full potential as human beings and as a country. We never fully become a land of opportunity while we allow racial inequality to persist. Ensuring equal opportunity for all is in our shared economic and societal interest and well being. Our country is multiracial, but we have diversity with a lot of segregation and inequality. We say we're a country founded on the ideals of opportunity and equality. So we have a real responsibility to live up to those values. Discrimination based on race is contrary to our values, and we need to do everything in our power to end it. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of how the issues of war, racism, and poverty are linked. He called for an all embracing and unconditional love for all mankind to combat the ills we face. Allow me now to introduce our distinguished moderator for today, who is Bruce Knotts. Bruce is the Executive Director of Unitarian Universalist Office at the United Nations and a board member of Religions for Peace USA, as well as a Parliament of the World's Religions. At this time, I turn the floor over to our moderator, Bruce Knotts.
Thank you very much, Audrey, for your clarifying and inspiring remarks about racism. And we will be focusing quite a bit on systemic racism here in the United States, but we will also talk about systemic racism around the world. And we do have one speaker who is calling in from Nairobi, Kenya, and what colonialism has done is just as devastating as what we have seen here in the United States. But let me get right to our panelists. We have a distinguished panel here. We do have one adjustment in our speakers, and I'll tell that to you in a minute. But our first speaker will be Reverend Charles Winder, who's an officer for social justice and engagement for the Episcopal Church USA. We had hoped to have Reverend Dr. Karen Thompson, but she is ill. And just at the very last minute, and we're very grateful to Reverend Ade Kraba, who is joining us. She's a Unitarian Universalist minister serving in New Braunfels, Texas. She earned her MDiv from the Star King School of Ministry in Berkeley, California. And before that, she earned her BA in Organizational Behavior from the University of San Francisco. And she has a long bio, but we don't have time to go into all of it. But we're so grateful to her for joining us literally at the last minute. We were afraid we were going to have an all-male panel, and Reverend Kraba has saved us from that fate. We also have Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who is calling in from Nairobi, Secretary General of the Global Network for Religions for Children and Director of the Arigatu International in Nairobi, Kenya. And in the conversation just leading up to this, we were mentioning that I survived the 1998 embassy bombing in Nairobi, and Mustafa was just a few yards away at the time. So we both went through that experience, but I still love the country. James Lynch is a certified Dharma teacher with Riso Kosakai. He's current president of the Buddhist Council of New York and treasurer of Religions for Peace. Very dear colleague. So the questions that I've given to our panelists to discuss are, first of all, and my husband is African American. He tells me all the time, Bruce, racism is your problem, not mine. This is for white people to fix. This is not for black people to fix. So I think we need to focus on that, and we need to discuss white privilege and what white people need to do to dismantle systemic racism, not only in the United States, but around the world. I think we need to talk about reparations, and reparations not only to African Americans, but again to Africans around the world, particularly in Africa, looking at the devastation of colonialism in Africa. I want us to look into our own faith traditions. How do we repair wrong? What does our faith tell us in repairing wrongful actions? How do we repent, and what does repentance mean? Does it just mean saying I'm sorry, or is it something more than that? And also about segregation in our own worship places. I want us to address all of these issues. So we'll get right to it, and we'll start with introductory remarks from all of our speakers, and we'll start with Reverend Charles Winder.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this conversation and dialogue with the fellow panelists and others who pose questions. And I'm thankful to my colleague, Reverend Margaret Rose, for helping to facilitate that introduction. Many of you know her as she is our leading staff person on the presiding bishop staff in the ecumenical and interfaith space. I serve on the presiding bishop staff for the Episcopal Church under the leadership of Presiding Bishop Michael Curry. And I'm part of a team of folks, the Reverend Isaiah Shaniqua Broken Leg, who's also staff officer for racial reconciliation, Reverend Melanie Mullen, who's our director, and Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers. And part of what we're charged with doing, I like to say, is enhancing the will and capacity of those in the Episcopal Church, our institutions, our congregations, networks, lay leaders, ordained leaders, and bishops, to really engage in these questions and to answer the call that we have in our faith tradition as followers of the way of Jesus. And as Bishop Curry reminds us, to be part of the Jesus movement through the lens of our tradition in the Episcopal Church, which really is one of the aspects of joining in the movement of God, in which all of us are invited to co-create a world that reflects God's justice as relates to whatever tradition that we're in. And so I'm looking forward to an engagement around these questions in the historic moment of this dual pandemic of where do we go? You know, how do we address in this global situation white supremacy, the value gap, as Eddie Glaude would talk about, in terms of the value gap that also is made transparent because of white supremacy. And what do we do to repair? What do we do to repair the ongoing breach, not just the historic breach, but the ongoing breach that has happened globally? And so I look forward to learning from the fellow panelists and those who have joined us. And I hope, Bruce, that's within 2 minutes. You asked us to touch on all the questions, but I'm sure your husband has also told you there's no way to address all those things in 2 minutes. So thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Yeah, my husband tells me a lot, but anyway, our next speaker, Reverend Ade Kraba, we're welcoming your remarks at this time. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Bruce. And I am honored that I was called to step in at the last minute, although it's kind of frightening. Uh, but I, like anyone else who was born and raised here in this country, you have witnessed a lot of things in terms of racism that has been directed toward African Americans. If you have not exactly experienced it personally, I just had that conversation with some members of my congregation yesterday. I'm the minister of the Unitarian Universalist New Braunfels Church here in Texas. And the conversation was, you must have some stories about some of the things that you've experienced growing up in Mississippi. And I said, truthfully, I can say that I have never personally experienced any of this, although I was raised during the Jim Crow era, where their signs were still up saying colored and white and directing you as to where you might go. But it's just as painful to stand by and watch people who look like you experience these things personally, even if you don't yourself. It's on the minds of everybody at this point. Where do we go from here? The pandemic has underscored just how deeply the divide is between white and Black people in this country in terms of economics and housing and jobs and everything else. So, it's one of the things that I think about on a daily basis. Where do we go from here? Because I have people in my family who no longer can go to work because you're supposed to go back out and start the economics up again. But if the place that you work is closed, there's nowhere to go. So what do? It gets deeper and deeper. It's like, how deep does the rabbit hole go in terms of where we are now based on the history of this country, and it's continuing. So I'm very interested in hearing from some of the esteemed panelists as to ideas that they might have in terms of what is next.
Thank you so very much. Yes, I appreciate your point that even when things don't happen to you directly, you're still injured. I think all of us were injured and hurt to witness the murder of George Floyd. And when we see that, and particularly if we're a person of color and we know that that can happen to us, that's a terrible traumatic injury. And so what do we do about it here? And our next speaker is Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, calling in from Nairobi, please.
Thank you, Bruce. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me start with a very short story. In the summer of 2002, while I was living in the United Kingdom studying for a PhD course, I decided to spend a few days in Belgium. So I took a bus from London to Brussels. On my way back to London, in Calais on the French side of the channel, just about to cross to the English Channel, all passengers alighted as was the practice. The driver of the bus I had boarded from Brussels to London refused me to board back with the rest of the passengers, claiming I was a refugee attempting to hitchhike or hide in the bus. All along, he was sneering at me. He clearly could not hide his feeling of disgust at me. He shouted at me not to board the bus. He was white. A few fellow passengers, old white women, shouted back at the driver, telling him I had been in that bus all along. They actually showed him my seat, and the driver stood down. I became aware of the many red faces in that bus. I presumed they were disappointed that I actually got onto the bus, got onto Dover and onto London. On the parking bays there in Calais and Dover side of the channel, there were Black Africans providing cheap labor, cleaning the trucks and cleaning the place. Friends, racism is the reason I was told not to board the bus to England. Racism is the reason there was such disgusting sneers in that bus when I boarded. Racism was the reason why there were Blacks cleaning the parking bay that we stopped by. Racism is a system. At the most fundamental level, racism has become a socio-economic hierarchy. The socio-economic, political, and cultural hierarchy created by racism was used to justify exploitation, violation, and murder of Africans, Asians, and indigenous communities around the world. Some whites who were not considered cultured and were not well off, such as the Irish, were also targeted by this racist system. Slavery was justified by religion. Genocide of indigenous Americans was legitimized by selective application of religious texts. Even today, Palestinians suffer, are dispossessed, and denied their rights because some religious texts are used to justify their oppression. 10 million Congolese Africans were killed at the behest of King Leopold II because of greed and colonialism, a despicable, massive acts of terror on an industrial scale, also justified by religious texts. And all along, our faith communities, except for a few squeaks here and there, have remained largely silent. This system of racism still exists today. It cannot be ended if we only look at it from color perspective only. The system that gave rise to and was perpetuated by racism must be fundamentally reformed if we are to end racism. And it's not just the whites, it's also Africans, Asians, Arabs that benefited from this system, that still wish to perpetuate this system because they are comfortable in that particular system. Friends, it's not going to be easy, but one thing is clear. If religion is going to be on the moral side of history this time around, then it has to give its all to challenge and end racism. And as I said earlier, Bruce, it's not a problem only for the whites. We need to own these problems as well. We have suffered, yes, but we see on daily basis racism being perpetuated, whether it's the caste system in India or the kind of tribal exclusion that we see in many parts of Africa. They derive from the very racist principles that they all actually did inherit from colonialists and the colonial past. And I believe religion has a place to fight and end racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, when we board buses and trains here in New York City and around the world, they get us attuned to calling out terrorism. And they say, if you see something, say something. Well, racism is terrorism. And when we see racism, we need to call it out. We need to intervene immediately and say, no, stop it. That's not the right way to do this. And there have been some instances recently where white people have confronted racists and told them to stand down. We need to have the courage to do that regularly and in every venue possible. Our last speaker for this session is James Lynch, very good friend and colleague. Thank you so much for being here, James.
Thank you, thank you. I want to piggyback on what Dr. Ali said. I think that, first of all, just for my journey, I want you guys to know, I'm a Buddhist practitioner with Risha Kosakai. I'm also the president of the Buddhist Council here in New York. We represent about anywhere from about 600,000 to about 800,000 Buddhists here, primarily Asian Americans in the main. That's a story in and of itself, but the reason why, how did I become the president of the Buddhist Council, that's a story. But I wanted to let you know that part of the reason why I became a Buddhism is because I wanted to find ways to go, where do we go from here? You know, I listened to what Reverend Krava said. In New York City, I'm in New York City where I'm at right now. And while people may not realize it, so many things, as the Dr. Ali had pointed out, are socioeconomic. And so racism, people could feel that they're okay and nothing's happening to them personally, but if their neighborhood has been disenfranchised, if they've been redlined, blacklined, if drugs have been introduced into their communities in such a way as that the police become an occupying force, you may not even realize the pressures that you're going under. And one of the challenges I had been doing in my life, I had started an organization called Renaissance Development Corporation, which was dedicated to housing homeless women and children. And I saw how the system was designed to dehumanize them. And so part of my journey and part of the reason why I come from two lines of, I'm putting my hands up, two lines of ministers on both sides of my family, Christian ministers. And one of the things that made me choose the Buddhist modality or practice was, how do we make this real? How do we turn the other cheek? How do we love the neighbor as I love myself? How do we do that? And so that's not just some words in a book, but becomes a living reality. So I think I would like to say in my closing part of this, as Dr. Ali pointed out, no, it's not just white people at issue. In fact, it can't be, because the story hasn't been told yet. We don't even know what we're fighting against fully. Obviously, if someone calls someone a bad name, we know that's inappropriate. But do we understand what it means for Blacks in Boston to only have $9 of net worth income? Do we understand that today, while people are marching, Black Lives Matter, people in Flint, Michigan are still drinking poisoned water in the United States? So we need to have a new reimagining of our faith and of our relationship to each other.
Thank you so much. Let me tell you a quick story. As announced, I work at an NGO at the United Nations, and we were going to hold a fundraiser at the mission of South Korea. And the UN was on lockdown. The New York Police Department had the whole place blocked off, and we had to bring in supplies, alcohol and drinks and food and all of that. And we couldn't. And so I went to the police that were standing around, and these were, the A-list cops that they sent to the United Nations, and they were very polite and said, well, we'll let you know as soon as we can when you can bring your stuff down. And then some white women on my committee went to the police and asked the same thing. And again, the police were very polite, very cordial. And then I saw my African-American husband approach the police to ask the same question that we had. And as I watched him walk, he's a 5'4", wonderful man, very kind, walking towards them, they all put their hands on their guns. They saw a black face and they put their hands on their guns. The only black senator in the U.S. Senate, who's a Republican, said he's been stopped by the police in Washington, D.C. 7 times just because he has a black face. So I want to turn the discussion to privilege. And Dr. Ali has mentioned to us that other people can have privilege, but we have a system of privilege, white privilege, and there are people that benefit from that, and then many people that don't benefit from it. So tell me about privilege, and how do we dismantle it? How do we make things equal and even? Our religious traditions tell us that we're all created in the image of God, that we're all essentially equal. Then why is it some people have privilege and then another person gets shot by the police, or police immediately see a black face and put their hand on their gun? How do we deal with that? How do we fix it? And you're not allowed to all be quiet. Somebody has to step up.
So I guess I'll take a first cut at it and try to be aware of the hour. I think you gave us some questions, and I think you were going to share with the folks who dialed in. And you started with white privilege, but I think the next question you had is, what is white supremacy? And I think that in terms of the question you just posed, before you get to privilege, the foundational piece becomes the notion of white supremacy. That those who became white, who the world began to interpret as being white, from Europe largely, that they, in all that they do, is better than anyone else. That they inherently are more human, more intelligent, and the list of attributes would go on, and that they have more value in the world, and are entitled to be treated a certain way, and also have a claim on the rest of the world in terms of being able to conquer and to carry space, in terms of that. At the root of that is a large part of the colonial project. And so, you know, the white supremacy is a larger concept that I think really speaks to this notion of white privilege. You can't, you know, the white privilege is made possible because of white supremacy, and it exists, as Reverend Lynch and others were saying, you know, within our systems of faith and our mental models of how we see the world. And so I think what has to, at its core, that white supremacy says that, you know, this Black person, this brown person, this indigenous person is less human than the white person is, or the person who may be of color themselves, who has interpreted and internalized the system of white supremacy, and therefore will engage that person as being less human, as being larger than life, some type of monster. So all of that combines in a way in which we see the violence. Just before getting on, I was looking, you know, on the social media and saw the stream of a Black woman at the Miami airport, and the officer there punched her square in her jaw as if he was in a boxing ring with no justification. And to be quite honest with you, it really tore at my stomach, because we keep seeing these things, but these things are also happening to people in our lives. So at the core, I think the reimagination, if you will, that President Lynch just gave us, in terms of how do we reimagine what it means to live into our faith tradition, and how do we embody that in our practices in the world, amongst each other, and amongst each other within our faith, but more importantly, beyond our faith traditions in the world. So I think, and then how do we repair all the harms created by white supremacy and the acting out? The hour is late, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I wanted to say this because I may not be able to come back through. A mentor of mine said it this way, and I think this fits into some of what Dr. Ali was saying, and Brother Lynch was saying, and Reverend Carver was saying as well. He said that, you know, let there be peace among us, and let us not be instruments of our own or others' oppression. And so when we attack the root of white supremacy and all that means, it requires us to work for a just earth, and let there be peace among us, and let us not be instruments of our own or others' oppression.
Thank you very much. And you remind us that white supremacy, white privilege, these have created injuries and harm which needs to be repaired. And I want us to continue to explore, how do we repair it? Because it's in the repairing that I think we start dealing with the problem. Without reparations, without repair, this will continue.
I was going to just, I wanted to jump back on Reverend Charles Allen. I appreciate kind words. To me, one of the things from Buddhism, we always say that we're all suffering delusion. We're all in a state of illness, and we're trying to cleanse our mind of the delusions that we have. And one of the texts that my particular group focuses on, the Lotus Sutra, and they say we're all in a burning house. And what happens is people are all sick in the burning house, and they start arguing, well, I'm in this room and I'm in that room, and I want to take this dog or that dog. The goal is to get out of the burning house. And so one of the things that we have to begin to understand is we have to get out of the burning house of what people frequently call white supremacy or white privilege, to see things as they are. Because if we continually fight only in terms of white people having to reform themselves, or the system that we currently see ourselves in, we just are trying to, in my opinion, take advantage of the very system that has brought us harm. You know, so there's a very dangerous position like that. For example, I'll give you a real situation. And I'm a nonviolent person. I'm in the peace movement. You know, I believe, as Martin Luther King said, let's establish the beloved community. Right? We need to figure out a way to establish the beloved community. Well, when we went to conflict in Libya, we removed a very bad actor there. You have Black women right now being sold in slavery today, right now, while we're sitting here. And there's organ harvesting today, right now. And nobody's doing anything, no marches, no organizations, no anything. So we have to understand we are not to act in accordance or against white privilege or white supremacy doesn't mean for us to use it in another way so that we get the privilege to harm other people. We have to find new ways to creatively reimagine what it means to be a human being and to recognize our connection to other people. That's
Thank you.
Bruce, I'd like to jump in here and piggyback on what's been said. I agree that it is a time to reimagine. And the reason we need to reimagine is because I personally don't think it's about repairing the system that we have, because it is an integral part of the foundation of what this very country is built on. When you're born into a world where the assumption is that everything is mine for the taking, and everybody that takes looks like me, so I don't see anything wrong with the system. So it's more about actually digging up, rooting up the entire system as it is, because the repair, what is the repair? What are we repairing? I mean, it's like the entire system was built on a fallacy.
Agreed.
Yeah, Bruce, let me just chime in here. And yeah, I mean, repairing would be an understatement. And I'm not too sure that the system can be repaired. It just has to be overhauled, and it will take time. I don't think it's something that can be done in a day or a year or even 10 years. I think it will take time. But what we need to understand really here is the corrosive nature of racism. It is corrosive. When we try and say, I saw somebody typing in, you know, white privilege is a polite way of putting it. And indeed, it is a very polite way of putting it. The racist system is so corrosive that if you come to Africa today, Bruce, you are in Nairobi for a long, if you walk into a restaurant, Bruce, you probably would be the first to be served, or you will be prioritized in being served by an African, because it's ingrained in our minds that you have to treat a white person in a certain way, because that's how it's been for the last 500 years, starting with slavery. And so it's a lot of propaganda, brainwashing, indoctrination that has come with white supremacy. At the core of this is really white supremacists, and many people are actually guilty as charged of white supremacy. If you can be, you may not be a racist, that but you can be racist if you support the system or benefit from the system that is racist in nature, and you don't question. If you are privileged at the expense of others and you don't question that privilege, then you are racist. You are benefiting from a system that has excluded other people. And therefore, we're talking about billions of world citizens that are racist, that are benefiting from this racist system. And so, I mean, we need to go the timeless traditions of our religious traditions, whether it's from Confucianism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism. In each and every of these religions, they'll tell you, right from Confucianism, do not treat others as you would, or rather treat others as you would have them treat yourself. Rabbi Hillel, who summarized the entire Torah, say to a pagan who wanted a summary in a second, and say, what, can you tell me what the Torah is about? And he said that treat others as you would like others to treat yourself. The rest is commentary. Go read them. But the whole Torah revolves around treating others as you would like them to treat yourself. In Islam, very clear, an Arab is not superior of an African or a white person or a person of color. We are all equal before God, and God created all of us in different nations and tribes and races so that we can speak to each other, not despise one another. And so I'm not romanticizing religion. As I said earlier, religion has been a part of the problem because we selectively look at religion and use some of those scriptures to justify racism. But in these sources, we might find solution. and faith communities have got to play a leading role, including those that have benefited from racism in the past.
So Bruce, I want to say, I agree with what has been said. I think the question of repair, though, is about the reparation as it relates to the harm and the wounds that have happened and continue to happen. And so I think the question of reparation is a significant one. And in terms of how that fits in, Dr. Ali talked about the Jewish tradition. It's there at the heart. Jewish people speak in their faith regarding the need to repair as part of the process of moving towards reconciliation. The Christian tradition, in terms of what our faith instructs us, is the same, right? So we have to tell the truth, we have to name the harm, and then the person in the institutions and the communities that have created the harm and participated in the harm have to make action to repair the harm, and restore people to a sense of wholeness and wellness. And Malcolm X talked about, if someone puts a knife in your back and you only take it, if it's 9 inches, you only take it out 3 inches, or even if you take it out 6 inches to relieve some of the pain, you have not made me well. You have to take the knife out and then heal me and to restore me, and then help me, as in the scripture in terms of the parable of the Samaritan, right? The parable of the Samaritan comes in and actually makes sure that I'm well and whole and that I don't have any economic harm, that all my bills are paid and that I can move forward whole. And so when we talk about reparation, it is a space beyond the United States context, where the reparations for African Americans or Black people in the United States is there, but also we have to look at reparations as it relates to our indigenous brothers and sisters. There's been a case of reparation as it relates to Japanese Americans. But when we talk about Afro-descended people, we know that in the Caribbean, the CARICOM nations have stated a claim of reparation as it relates to almost every country in Europe, because most of the wealth that currently exists, most of those buildings that people go to in tourism, they came out of the slave trade and also the colonial project. And so the reparation as it relates to nations in Africa. Now, the Special Rapporteur at the United Nations on Racism and Intolerance has issued a paper around reparations that talks about repairing the prior harm, but also how do we look at reparations from a standpoint of development going forward. And in that, it's not a reform of any systems, it is a transformation of systems that is needed in order to repair the breach and to heal the wound.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I think that explanation is very good and important, repairing, and it's now very clear, and it's about reparations that goes just, is to repair what has been damaged, and get on to the reparations. So those are stages, I believe, and then we need to move after reparations, or as reparations is something that is being done, we need to focus on other systemic issues. So I agree with my colleague there pretty much on repairing and reparations.
Let me just lift up one example that I use quite a bit, and it's Germany. And of course, the Germans perpetuated the Holocaust, killed 6 million Jews and many millions of others. And they have paid reparations to the survivors of the Holocaust. And even more importantly, they teach the Holocaust in their schools. So all the young Germans that are growing up now that didn't even live through that period are educated to know what Germany did, what their ancestors did. And so there's an awareness in Germany. And so far as I can see, Germany seems to have turned itself around on that issue. Not perfectly, it hasn't done everything absolutely perfectly. But here in the United States, we don't really even learn about slavery or the consequences of slavery or the consequences of racism. And we certainly have not even, we haven't even apologized. It was mentioned that there wasn't apologies to the Japanese Americans who were interned during Second World War, and that was by Ronald Reagan because that was a personal desire of his. He had seen the internment camps and was offended by it. But we haven't even yet apologized for slavery and for racism, and without even an acknowledgement that this is something we did. And we don't teach it. We don't teach it properly in our schools. But I'll be quiet. I'm not a
No,
panelist here.
I was going to say something, but I wanted to make sure that Reverend Graba might want to say something.
Yes, I did want to say something, and I agree with what has been said in terms of repairing reparations in it of itself. However, what you're saying, Bruce, is about the teaching and acknowledging. I mean, today, the textbooks have redefined slavery, and we become immigrants to this country. So, I mean, just the textbooks alone are just a part of, just a small part of everything that is wrong with the system that needs to be dismantled. I mean, there has to be an awareness of that there was something done wrong. And there seems to be a lack of awareness that anything was even done to harm a whole nation of people, with the beginning of stealing the land that people were brought here to be enslaved in. So yeah, there's a lot to be done.
Thank you. Again, my husband tells me it's often I will say, immigrants came here, people came here and took the land from the indigenous people. And my husband would say, well, my people didn't. We didn't come here. We were brought here. And we had nothing to do with stealing the land from indigenous people. So even in our discourse, we're not getting it quite right. And I'm glad I have a husband that corrects me all the time. James.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. One point I did want to bring up, a lot of times for me, it's called narratives. It's like reframing. We must properly reframe the issue. And so sometimes we only think of reparations, for me, in terms of slavery. But ongoing harms that have continued to happen require reparations and healing. So what ends up happening is people come to the United States and says, well, I wasn't here when slavery took place, and I'm being punished for what happened, right? What they don't understand is that there's been a continuation of certain practices and ideologies based on peonage. Say with my favorite is, because I'm a recovering attorney. I always say that. One of my favorite one is the mass incarceration movement, right? But the truth of the matter is, and I was thinking about this before, in 1971, the war on drugs was created by Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon says, through John Ehrlichman, and he made in his recent statement, now it's way back, 1997, he said, we couldn't make blacks illegal. So we said, let's make a war on them so we could imprison their leaders, disrupt their communities, all right, and control them. So if that's the case, that's well after slavery. And that pattern we see 1994 with the new crime bill, right? And so we see this sort of, the final part of that is, I would want to point out, many people may not realize, the private prison industry has actually become a cottage industry for products, and also for local communities to actually have more additional federal funds to come to them, because the prisoners are counted as for being part of that community. So we have to address all of those types of things in reparations in order to correctly reflect and correct, is the term Buddhism would say. Let's reflect and then correct.
Yeah, Bruce, talking of reparations, isn't it amazing that Germany paid reparations because of genocide, because of killing 6 million Jews, Romas, and others? And Belgium has only apologized. The Belgian king apologized 2 days ago, only 2 days ago, recently, about killing 10 million Congolese. No reparations has been paid. There's no talk about reparations. Can you imagine how racist that is at different levels?
Yes, absolutely. What about our own religious traditions? Are our religions, and together as an interfaith group, are we Are we part of the solution? Are we part of the problem? Is there work we need to do on ourselves as people of faith?
I think I want to briefly enter that question. Is I would say that, borrowing from or giving attribution to Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, that as it relates to church, as it relates to Christians, the notion of being church, as she says, is aspirational. It's something that we're constantly trying to live into. So I think that in my faith tradition as a Christian, as an Episcopalian, that the aspiration is to live into the ways of following Jesus fully, and to co-laboring with God and Jesus in terms of creating a just earth. And so we are part of the problem, and we have a call to participate actively with others beyond our tradition and in our tradition to work for that just earth, addressing white supremacy and building something new. And I would say that it's a simultaneous process. It's not, let me start with myself only, and then once I fix internally, then I will do the work with others. No. It is, I believe we're called to work on the system of church and churches, the institution piece, and how folks relate to one another, and how the processes and procedures and the practices. And then also, while also doing that, be out in the world in an interfaith and ecumenical ways to do the work, to really do the work of transforming systems and policies and practices and the ways of being, so that we can, again, live into a world where there's love and compassion and ultimately justice.
There's a question. Thank you very much for that. There's a question in the chat box about missionaries, and it reminds me of Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first president of independent Kenya. And he said the missionaries came to Kenya and they had the Bible and we had the land, and we closed our eyes to pray.
Yep.
And when we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible.
Had the Bible.
So comments, Reverend Caraba.
I would just like to add on to what's been said in terms of striving, in terms of faith systems. Unitarian Universalists, I think we have a little more difficulty because we are Unitarian Universalists and we're not all in one lane in terms of what that means. We are governed by our 7 principles, but we also have a polity where we can, we're independent thinkers in that way. And so we have our own issues that we are working on all the time. And it is a striving to make the world a better place. And that means working with everyone in terms of that, because again, to go back to what was said before about religions, they all have this one tenet that we lift up in terms of love your neighbor and do unto others as you would have people do unto you. And sometimes that's not all that great, but it does take a lot of striving together, not just independent ministers and ministries doing that, because if we're all trying to live in a world that is just and peaceful for everybody, it does take a lot of stretching and growing and working together. It's not something where you can just say, okay, I've gotten there now because your congregation is doing all the good stuff in your community. It's a lot more than that.
Go ahead, James.
No, I was just going to quickly say that that's why we're here. I mean, that's why we're here. We're taking the half a step by engaging with each other from our various faith traditions. I look at the panels of Quakers, not on this particular panel, but the people who've tuned in. You have Muslims, you have Quakers, you have the Parliament for World Religions, you have Religions for Peace. And if we can just take a half a step towards each other in a humane way, recognizing that we have to cherish each moment that we have and that each moment is sacred, then we can begin the process of healing and reconciliation. express Buddhism.
There's some comment in the chat box, and I think we need to address it. And it has to do with our heroes and heroines, people that we honor as great people in the past. Mahatma Gandhi, who freed his people and freed his nation from colonialism, was a racist. He didn't do anything for the Black South Africans in South Africa. He only worked for his own people. Aung San Suu Kyi won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing democracy to Myanmar and is considered a great leader. And yet her state there is doing horrible things to the Rohingya Muslims. And so here you've got these great inspirational leaders that we look up to, and they're falling short. What do you think about that?
I think in all of it, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Reverend. Please.
I think all of us, no matter what tradition we attempt to live into, come up short. And I think the call is to be in relationship with each other in a way that we hold one another accountable to create stronger relationships. And I think in each of the faiths that are represented on the call, panelists and beyond, we have warning of worshiping or holding up, an individual person or people as being beyond human, as being some heretical type of practice. So that's not by way of giving excuse, but it's by way of saying again that we have to tell the truth about people and their full humanity, and address when they've fallen short and address where they've fallen short of their call. But then we also have to, as Brother Lynch said, recognize when we ourselves are complicit, which is why I say again, let there be peace among us, and let us not be instruments of our own or others' oppression.
And I was just going to thank you. I was going to say basically something similar to that. Say it's practice, not perfection. It's practice, not perfection. And if we're looking for that perfect person to idolize, then that's your object of worship. Then that becomes your object of worship. You need to keep your eye on the object of worship. If you worship God, if you worship Allah, Yahweh, whatever your object of worship is, that's where you need to keep your mind, because that's what will follow your behavior. Every human being sometimes falls short. So I think it's the actions of practice and giving people license to be okay and to grow.
Thank you. Reverend Karaba, final word from you.
Yes, we're all in a state of becoming. It is a practice, and no one is perfect. And I do agree that your eye should be on that particular part of your ideology, not the person that is presenting it. So we all have to make each other accountable for our own behaviors and actions.
And I do want to say one thing about Myanmar. For example, here in New York, we've had Buddhist panels specifically discussing that issue, because it's not enough for us to just identify the issue. We have to then take actions based upon what we know to be right. That
Absolutely.
has to be the key point. I want to make sure that that's clear. I don't want to go for that.
And Mustafa, final word.
Thank you, Bruce. And for those that have caused a lot of damage to the world because of that have created this system of racism, a lot more is expected of them to repair this system. We all responsible, of course, and we need to play our parts together. We can bring this world to be a better place for our children to grow in.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely outstanding panel, and we'll give the final word to the moderator of Religions for Peace USA, Imam Naim Beg. Please, we're ready for your words.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everyone, all the panelists. Dr. Mustafa, Reverend Ade Karaba, thank you. Reverend Charles Allen Winder, James, and Audrey Kitagawa. So all of you, I'm very thankful to all of you, your participation. It is a difficult topic. It's not an easy topic to speak about. And as I was listening to the conversation and that was taking place, there were moments that I was deeply moved from your personal stories, from your own experiences, and experiences from your families. And just because of a different color of a skin, how perceptions change, how society behaves, how arrogance comes in. And this is the word that has been coming to my mind all along, that which comes from the Quran, that when God Almighty created Adam from a dust, and Quran talks about it, that you're all created from dust. And the arrogance of the Satan, that who just didn't want to listen to the word of God, to the commandment of God, because the argument was that I am created by fire and this is created by clay. And so you want me to, accept this? And this is what I'm hearing. So today, there is obviously the issue of race that we are talking about. There is an economic arrogance that we see in our world. There is a racial arrogance, there is cultural arrogance, there is religious arrogance in the society. And this is the arrogance that is bringing down, the whole humanity. I'm glad that, Bruce, you mentioned Gandhi and his attitude towards Black South Africans, calling them uncivilized, calling them lowly human beings, and or the issue that we're seeing in China, and or in Libya, and these, all of that is not being addressed. And that is what is harming, that is what is creating this uh, this problem, not just in the US but globally, the annexation of the properties in Palestine. So the message is the whoever has the power, use your power, and the whole world will remain quiet. This is what we are seeing in Kashmir or other places. And the thought that I was listening was, love your neighbor. And then in the Quran, God Almighty tells us, neighbor who's near and neighbor who's far. So this build, this bridging of humanity, that we're all close to one another. We may want to build walls to keep some people away, but what we did to the people who were living here, and we called ourselves that we discovered this nation, people were living here. So these are the things that we need to address. And one of the aspects of reconciliation, I was looking at the story of Yusuf in the Quran, Joseph. It is in the Bible, that the reconciliation happens when the oppressor accepts their oppression, that they committed oppression. Without that, reconciliation wouldn't happen. Without that, the poor and the oppressed are still being pushed. Accept this reconciliation, no matter what is being presented to you. So this acceptance of the oppressive regimes, of the oppressive nature of the people, has to be addressed. And when they will say that, yes, we made the mistake, when people will come to this understanding, yes, we were wrong, yes, we made the mistake, then reconciliation can start to happen. And I close our today's panel with this saying of Martin Luther King Jr., which I really, really love, when he said, greatest tragedy is not the brutality of the evil, but silence of the good people. So good people cannot remain silent when we see what is happening, oppression taking place, dhulm, as we say in Islam, taking place, that we cannot remain silent. This is not what makes us good people. And it is challenging, it is difficult, but this is what God commands us to do. Thank you very much.